If you think an old dress tells you everything about a woman, you may be the poorest person in the room. My daughter-in-law laughed loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear, and although no one realized it in that moment, those words would become the greatest mistake she had ever made. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I am 72 years old, and after 46 years of marriage, I believe there was very little left that could surprise me. I had seen businesses rise and fall, neighbors come and go, children grow into adults with minds of their own, and fashion circle back around more times than I cared to count. But nothing prepared me for watching the woman I loved become the target of quiet humiliation inside the very family she had spent decades supporting. It happened during a Sunday dinner at my son Michael's beautiful home just outside Chicago. The neighborhood was the kind where every lawn looked professionally trimmed, every mailbox matched the next, and every driveway held a luxury SUV polished until it reflected the afternoon sun. Michael and his wife, Brittany, loved entertaining. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath elegant lighting. Fresh flowers stood in the center of the dining table. Classical music drifted softly through hidden speakers. Everything looked perfect, at least until Eleanor walked through the front door, wearing the same light blue cardigan she had owned for nearly 15 years. I recognized it immediately because she always smiled whenever she wore it. She said it was comfortable enough to feel like home. The sleeves had been carefully repaired more than once, though unless someone looked closely, they would never notice. She paired it with simple beige slacks and sensible shoes she preferred for long walks around our neighborhood. Eleanor had never cared about designer labels or expensive jewelry. She believed kindness aged better than fashion. Unfortunately, Brittany believed the opposite. The moment Eleanor stepped into the dining room carrying the homemade apple pie she had baked before sunrise, Brittany looked her up and down with an expression that reminded me of someone inspecting a piece of furniture at a garage sale. She waited until every guest had settled into conversation before smiling sweetly and saying, "Mrs. Whitmore, I honestly thought that sweater retired before I was born." A few nervous chuckles floated around the table. Someone looked down at their plate. Someone else pretended to sip wine. Michael lowered his eyes and reached for his fork without saying a single word. My chest tightened, but before I could answer, Brittany continued. "You know, there are wonderful boutiques for seniors now. We could even help you pick something that belongs in this decade." She laughed softly at her own joke. Two of her friends laughed with her, perhaps out of politeness more than agreement. Eleanor never flinched. She simply placed the pie on the counter, folded her hands, and thanked Brittany for the suggestion with the same calm voice she used to greet our neighbors every morning. That quiet grace only seemed to encourage Brittany further. "Honestly," she added while adjusting the sleeve of her designer jacket, "people judge families by appearances. We all have to make an effort." I looked at my wife, expecting disappointment, perhaps even hurt, but instead I saw something I had learned to recognize over nearly half a century together. Eleanor was thinking. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't defeated. She was simply observing everyone in the room, as though carefully filing away every expression, every silence, every choice people made when kindness required courage. Then she looked at me with the smallest smile, the kind only I understood. It was the same smile she wore years earlier whenever life presented a challenge that looked much bigger than it truly was. She gently touched my hand beneath the table and whispered, "Thomas, would you mind saving me a slice of pie? I'll be back in a little while." Before anyone could ask where she was going, she picked up her handbag, thanked everyone for inviting us, and quietly walked out the front door. Brittany leaned back in her chair with a satisfied grin. "Well," she said while lifting her wine glass, "maybe she'll finally buy something fashionable." Around the table, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. No one realized that within the hour, every assumption they had made about Eleanor Whitmore would be turned upside down. After Eleanor quietly stepped outside, I remained seated at the table, staring at the untouched pie she had baked that morning. The sweet scent of cinnamon and warm apples still lingered in the dining room, mixing with the expensive perfume and polished wood that surrounded us. No one reached for the dessert. No one seemed quite sure what to say. Brittany continued chatting with her guests as though nothing unusual had happened, laughing about a new designer collection she planned to buy before the holidays. The conversation drifted toward luxury vacations, country clubs, and custom kitchens, but every word felt strangely hollow to me. I had spent almost half a century beside Eleanor, and I knew something everyone else at that table had forgotten. My wife had never walked away because she was embarrassed. She walked away only when she had already made up her mind. That quiet confidence was one of the reasons I had fallen in love with her all those years ago. We first met at a community library when I was 24 and she was 21. She was wearing a simple cotton dress that probably cost less than the dinner I took her to afterward, yet she carried herself with a dignity that no expensive outfit could ever imitate. Over the years, very little about her changed. Even after promotions, investments, and comfortable retirement savings gave us the ability to enjoy a much more luxurious lifestyle, Eleanor remained exactly the same. She believed money was a tool, never an identity. Whenever I suggested replacing one of her favorite sweaters, she would smile and remind me that if something still served its purpose, throwing it away simply because it was no longer fashionable made very little sense. She donated generously to local charities without ever attaching her name to a building or asking for recognition. She quietly paid for school supplies for children whose families struggled. She helped neighbors after storms damaged their homes. More than once, she wrote anonymous checks so someone else could keep their dignity. Yet she still preferred clipping coupons for groceries because, as she often joked, saving $1 was just as satisfying as earning one. Brittany never understood that way of thinking. To her, appearance was proof of success. If someone wore designer labels, they deserved admiration. If they drove an expensive vehicle, they must be important. Somewhere along the way, she had mistaken wealth for worth. What saddened me most was seeing Michael slowly adopt that same outlook. As a little boy, he never cared what Eleanor wore. He proudly held her hand during school events, introducing her as the smartest person he knew. She helped him build science projects, stayed awake through sleepless nights when he was sick, and celebrated every small achievement with genuine joy. Looking at him now, silently staring into his glass while his wife mocked the woman who had raised him, I wondered when that gentle young man had disappeared. Across the table, one of Brittany's friends finally broke the silence by asking where Eleanor had gone. Brittany shrugged with an amused smile. She said that perhaps my wife had decided it was time for a shopping trip after all. A few people forced polite laughter, but it sounded weaker than before. Even those who had smiled earlier now seemed uncomfortable. There is a moment in every gathering when people quietly begin questioning whether they have been standing on the wrong side of a conversation. I could feel that moment settling over the room like a slow-moving cloud. I checked the grandfather clock in the hallway. Only 15 minutes had passed since Eleanor left, although it felt much longer. I found myself remembering something she had said while we drank coffee just a week earlier. She had looked out our kitchen window and smiled before saying, "Thomas, character is the only thing that becomes more valuable when the years leave their marks on it." At the time, I simply nodded because it sounded like another one of her thoughtful observations. Sitting there now, surrounded by polished silverware and uneasy smiles, those words carried an entirely different weight. I had no idea where Eleanor had gone, but I trusted her completely. And for reasons I could not yet explain, I had the unmistakable feeling that before this evening ended, everyone seated around that elegant dining table would discover just how little they truly knew about the remarkable woman they believed they had already judged. The quiet tension around the table became impossible to ignore. Even Brittany seemed to sense that her jokes had not landed the way she expected. She tried filling the silence by describing a luxury resort where she and Michael planned to vacation the following spring. She talked about oceanfront suites, private chefs, and exclusive shopping districts as though those things automatically impressed everyone listening. Most of the guests nodded politely, but the warmth that had filled the room earlier had quietly disappeared. I noticed one elderly couple exchanging uncertain glances before looking toward the front window, almost as if they were wondering whether Eleanor would actually come back. Michael finally cleared his throat. "Dad, do you think Mom is all right?" His voice sounded calm, yet I recognized the concern hiding underneath. I looked at my son for several long seconds before answering. "Your mother has always been all right, Michael. The better question is whether the rest of us have been." He lowered his eyes without responding. Brittany quickly laughed to break the awkward moment. "Thomas, you know I was only teasing. We all joke about fashion." I looked at her kindly, without raising my voice. There is a difference between laughing with someone and laughing at someone. She forced another smile and reached for her glass. You are taking this far too seriously." Perhaps she believed that repeating those words would make them true. I had heard similar explanations before whenever someone realized they had crossed a line. It was never meant that way. It was only a joke. Do not be so sensitive. Yet somehow the people expected to forgive were always the same people who had quietly carried the embarrassment. One of the younger guests suddenly asked how long Eleanor and I had been married. 46 years, I answered proudly. His eyes widened. That is incredible. What is your secret? Before I could answer, Brittany smiled confidently. Thomas has always been patient. A few people chuckled, but I slowly shook my head. No, the secret has always been Eleanor. Every face turned toward me. She taught me that respect is something you practice on ordinary days, not just special occasions. She taught me that the nicest person in the room often owns the fewest expensive things. She taught me that confidence never needs an audience. The dining room became so quiet that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Michael rubbed his hands together nervously. Dad, Brittany did not mean to hurt Mom. I studied my son's face. Intentions matter, Michael, but choices matter more. His shoulders sank. I could tell he was beginning to replay the evening in his own mind, remembering every opportunity he had missed to stand beside his mother. I felt sadness more than anger. Parents spend decades teaching their children how to treat others, yet adulthood eventually reveals whether those lessons truly took root. Brittany suddenly stood and walked toward the large front window. Well, if she really went shopping, maybe she found something exciting. She pulled back the curtain with an amused smile, but her expression quickly changed into puzzled curiosity. That is strange, she murmured. Several guests stood beside her. I remained seated. Through the window, I could see headlights turning slowly into the long driveway. At first, I assumed someone had simply taken the wrong address. The vehicle moved with calm precision beneath the soft glow of the landscape lighting before stopping directly in front of the entrance. It was long, elegant, and unmistakably refined even from a distance. No one at the table spoke. One guest quietly whispered that it looked like a professionally chauffeured luxury automobile. Another guest leaned closer to the glass, trying to recognize the polished silver grille reflecting the porch lights. Brittany frowned, clearly confused. Who could possibly be arriving now? She asked. I did not answer because I honestly did not know. Then the driver stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, walked around the vehicle with practiced confidence, and respectfully opened the rear passenger door. Every conversation inside the house stopped at once as all eyes focused on the person preparing to step onto the driveway. Eleanor stepped gracefully out of the automobile, and for a brief moment it felt as though time itself had slowed. She was no longer wearing the faded blue cardigan that Brittany had mocked only minutes earlier. Instead, she wore an elegant ivory cashmere coat over a beautifully tailored navy dress that fit her with timeless sophistication rather than extravagance. A delicate pearl necklace rested around her neck, and her silver hair had been neatly styled, framing the same calm smile she had carried into our lives for nearly 5 decades. Nothing about her appearance was loud or flashy. It was simply graceful. The chauffeur closed the rear door with practiced precision before offering her a respectful nod. Eleanor thanked him warmly, not with the distant politeness of someone speaking to hired help, but with the familiar kindness she offered everyone, whether they were a neighbor, a grocery clerk, or a successful executive. Through the front window, I watched Brittany's confident expression slowly disappear. Her eyes widened as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Who is that driver? One guest whispered. Is that really Eleanor? Another quietly asked. Michael stood frozen beside the dining table, his mouth slightly open. I could almost hear the questions racing through his mind because the truth was, I was asking many of the same ones myself. Eleanor had always preferred simplicity. She owned beautiful clothing, but she almost never wore it. She never believed elegance required an audience. The front door opened, and Eleanor entered the house with the same gentle smile she had worn when she left. She did not hurry. She did not seek attention. She simply walked inside as though nothing unusual had happened. Behind her, the chauffeur remained near the entrance, waiting patiently with quiet professionalism. Brittany forced a nervous laugh. Well, someone certainly had a quick makeover. Her voice no longer carried the confidence it had only 20 minutes earlier. Eleanor looked at her kindly. I stopped by an appointment that had already been scheduled. Her answer was calm and uncomplicated. One of the guests looked toward the driveway again. That is a Rolls-Royce, is it not? Before anyone else could respond, the chauffeur stepped inside just far enough to speak respectfully. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Hawthorne asked me to remind you that the board members have already arrived, but he told me to assure you there is absolutely no rush. Eleanor smiled warmly. Please let Mr. Hawthorne know I appreciate his patience. Family always comes first. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, the chauffeur replied before stepping back outside. The room became perfectly silent. Nobody seemed interested in dessert anymore. Nobody mentioned designer clothing. The only sound came from the ticking clock in the hallway. Brittany looked from Eleanor to me and then back toward the waiting automobile. Board members? She finally asked. What board members? Eleanor removed her gloves carefully before placing them beside her handbag. The quarterly meeting for the Whitmore Family Foundation, she answered with complete composure. I promised I would stop by for a few minutes this evening. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. One gentleman quietly asked whether it was the charitable foundation that had recently funded scholarships across 3 counties. Eleanor gave a modest nod. We have been fortunate enough to help where we can. I watched every face around the table change. People who had barely acknowledged Eleanor's presence earlier were now studying her with curiosity and growing respect. Brittany, however, seemed unable to process what she had just heard. I did not know you were involved with anything like that, she said softly. Eleanor smiled in exactly the same gentle way she always had. You never asked. Those 3 simple words carried no anger, no pride, and no desire for revenge. They were merely the truth. At that moment, I realized something remarkable. Eleanor had not returned to prove anyone wrong. She had returned exactly as she always lived, allowing character to speak long before possessions ever needed to. And somehow, without raising her voice even once, she had already transformed the entire room. Eleanor slowly took her seat again, smoothing the front of her dress with the same quiet composure she had shown throughout the evening. She did not look around the room searching for approval because she had never measured her value by other people's opinions. The guests, however, looked at her very differently now. The atmosphere that had once been filled with casual conversation had become thoughtful and restrained. It was remarkable how quickly assumptions could disappear once the truth quietly entered the room. One of the women seated near the end of the table leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you do not mind my asking, but why have you always dressed so simply if you have been involved in something so significant? Eleanor smiled gently before answering. Because I never wanted my clothing to introduce me before my character had the chance. The room fell silent again. Even Brittany seemed unable to find another clever remark. Eleanor continued in the same calm voice. When someone is kind to me because they think I have influence or money, I learn very little about them. But when someone is kind before they know anything about my circumstances, I learn everything I need to know. Her words were not directed toward anyone in particular, yet everyone understood them. Michael slowly stood from his chair and walked over to his mother. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. Mom, he said quietly, I should have spoken up when Brittany made those comments. I knew they were wrong, but I stayed silent because I wanted to avoid an argument. Eleanor reached for his hand. Silence is comfortable in the moment, Michael, but it often becomes heavy afterward. He lowered his head. I am sorry. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. I believe you are. Watching them together reminded me of the countless evenings Eleanor had spent helping Michael with homework at our kitchen table, encouraging him whenever he doubted himself, reminding him that integrity mattered far more than popularity. Those lessons had not disappeared completely. They had simply been buried beneath years of distraction and misplaced priorities. Brittany remained seated, staring into her untouched glass of sparkling water. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain rather than confident. Finally, she stood and walked toward Eleanor. I owe you an apology, she said softly. I judged you without knowing you. I thought appearances told the whole story. Eleanor looked at her with genuine kindness. Many people make that mistake. Brittany swallowed before continuing. I wanted everyone to admire me. Somewhere along the way, I started believing expensive things made me successful. Eleanor shook her head gently. Success is not something you wear. It is something people remember after you leave the room. No one interrupted. Those words seemed to settle over the table more powerfully than any lecture ever could. One of the guests quietly admitted that he had also assumed Eleanor lived a modest life because she could not afford anything more. Another guest confessed that he had once judged a neighbor in much the same way and now regretted it. What began as an uncomfortable family dinner slowly transformed into an honest conversation about pride, generosity, and the easy habit of making assumptions. Outside, the chauffeur remained patiently beside the automobile, never once looking at his watch or appearing impatient. Inside, Eleanor reached for the apple pie she had baked before sunrise and carefully cut the first slice. She placed it on Brittany's plate before serving anyone else. Brittany looked surprised. "After everything I said, you are serving me first?" Eleanor smiled warmly. Kindness means the most when it is offered to someone who least expects it. I watched Brittany's eyes begin to glisten as she quietly thanked her. There was no dramatic confrontation, no harsh punishment, and no attempt to embarrass anyone in return. Eleanor had answered ridicule with dignity and pride with grace. As I looked around the table, I realized that every person present would remember the elegance of her response far longer than they would remember the luxury automobile waiting outside. In that moment, I understood once again why I had spent 46 wonderful years loving the most extraordinary woman I had ever known. Eleanor quietly set the serving knife beside the pie plate and looked around the table with the same peaceful expression she had worn throughout the evening. No one rushed to speak. The atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured by words alone. Earlier, everyone had been watching her clothes. Now they were listening to every sentence she spoke. The difference had nothing to do with the automobile waiting outside. It had everything to do with perspective. I poured 2 cups of coffee, one for Eleanor and one for myself, just as I had done almost every evening since we retired. She smiled her familiar smile when I placed the cup beside her. It was a small habit, almost invisible to everyone else. Yet those ordinary moments had carried our marriage through decades of changing circumstances. Expensive possessions had come and gone. Careers had ended. Friends had moved away. Fashion had changed more times than either of us could remember. But respect had remained constant. One of the younger guests finally asked the question everyone had been wondering about. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you have been leading a charitable foundation for so many years, why have you never spoken about it?" Eleanor stirred her coffee slowly before answering. "Because generosity becomes smaller the moment it is used to impress people." The young man nodded thoughtfully. "Then why did you come back dressed differently?" Eleanor glanced toward me before answering. "I did not come back to prove that I could afford beautiful clothing. I came back because I had already promised a room full of volunteers that I would attend an important meeting this evening. I simply changed into what was appropriate for that commitment." She paused for a moment before continuing. "The unfortunate timing allowed everyone here to see how quickly appearances can change, while character remains exactly the same." Her words settled gently over the room. Nobody argued with them because there was nothing to argue against. Michael remained standing beside his mother. "I have been thinking about something," he admitted quietly. "When I was a little boy, you used to tell me never to judge anyone before learning their story. I repeated those words to my own children, but somewhere along the way I stopped living by them myself." Eleanor reached up and straightened the collar of his shirt exactly as she had done when he was preparing for school many years ago. "Life gives all of us opportunities to remember who we wanted to become." Michael smiled sadly. "I hope it is not too late." "As long as we are willing to change," Eleanor replied. "It is never too late." Brittany remained unusually quiet. She watched the exchange between mother and son with thoughtful eyes instead of defensive ones. Finally, she walked toward the kitchen, returned carrying several clean dessert plates, and began serving the guests without being asked. It was a simple gesture, but I noticed Eleanor noticed it as well. Genuine change rarely begins with dramatic speeches. More often it begins with one quiet decision made after an uncomfortable truth has finally been accepted. As everyone enjoyed the pie, the conversation gradually shifted away from luxury brands and expensive vacations. Instead, people shared stories about parents, grandparents, teachers, and neighbors whose kindness had quietly shaped their lives. Laughter returned to the dining room, but it sounded different now. It was warmer, softer, and free from the need to impress anyone. Outside, the chauffeur respectfully waited until Eleanor finished her coffee before stepping to the doorway. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely, "Mr. Hawthorne asked me to let you know that the meeting has been delayed another 30 minutes. He said everyone understands that family moments cannot always be scheduled." Eleanor thanked him sincerely. After he stepped outside again, one guest smiled and said, "People must think very highly of you." Eleanor looked around the table before answering with quiet humility, "I hope they think highly of the work we do together. No worthwhile accomplishment is ever achieved by one person alone." I looked at my wife and realized that nothing remarkable had truly changed about her that evening. The remarkable change had taken place in everyone else. They had finally stopped seeing an old cardigan and started seeing the extraordinary woman who had been wearing it all along. The evening slowly settled into a comfortable rhythm that none of us could have imagined only an hour earlier. The expensive dining room no longer felt like a place where people competed to impress one another. Instead, it felt like a family gathering should have felt from the beginning. Eleanor never mentioned the comments that had been made about her cardigan. She never reminded anyone how uncomfortable she had been made to feel. She simply continued treating every guest with the same warmth she had shown from the moment she first walked through the front door. That quiet consistency was something I had admired for decades. Character, I had learned, was not revealed when life was easy. It revealed itself when someone had every reason to become bitter but chose grace instead. Michael remained close to his mother throughout the rest of the evening. Every so often I caught him watching her with an expression that reminded me of the little boy who once believed she could solve every problem in the world. I knew he was replaying the evening in his mind, wishing he had stood beside her sooner. Regret has a way of making ordinary memories feel much heavier. As the guests continued talking, one older gentleman asked Eleanor whether the foundation had always been her dream. She smiled gently before answering. "Helping people has always been the dream. The foundation simply became one way to do it." He nodded with genuine admiration. "Most people would have wanted recognition." Eleanor shook her head softly. "Recognition fades. The difference you make in another person's life stays with them much longer." Brittany listened quietly from across the table. Earlier, she had been eager to guide every conversation toward luxury brands, exclusive neighborhoods, and expensive purchases. Now she asked a very different question. "What made you decide to live so simply when you could have enjoyed so much more?" Eleanor looked toward the front window for a moment before answering. "Because I grew up watching my parents lose almost everything during difficult times. They taught me that comfort can disappear overnight, but kindness and wisdom cannot be taken away. I promised myself that I would never confuse having more with being more." Brittany lowered her eyes. "I think I spent too many years chasing the wrong things." Eleanor smiled with genuine compassion. "Many people do. The important part is recognizing it before too much time passes." No accusation followed those words. No lecture. Only an open door for someone willing to become better. I watched Brittany take a slow breath before quietly removing the expensive bracelet she had proudly shown everyone earlier that evening. She placed it beside her plate as though, for the first time, it no longer mattered. Then she stood and carried empty dishes into the kitchen without saying another word. She was not trying to impress anyone anymore. She was simply helping. It was a small change, but real change often begins with small choices repeated consistently. As I watched her disappear into the kitchen, Eleanor leaned toward me and whispered, "Do you see it?" I smiled. "I think I do." She gently squeezed my hand beneath the table. "People are capable of surprising us in good ways too, Thomas. We should never forget that." Her words reminded me why she had never allowed disappointment to harden her heart. She believed that every person deserved the opportunity to grow after facing an uncomfortable truth. Before long, laughter returned once again, but this time it came naturally. Guests helped clear the table. Someone brewed fresh coffee. Another guest complimented Eleanor's homemade pie, saying it was better than any dessert served in the city's finest restaurants. Eleanor laughed softly and promised to share the recipe. Looking around the room, I realized that nobody was paying attention to the automobile outside anymore. The most valuable thing Eleanor had brought back into that house was not elegance, influence, or success. It was perspective. And somehow, by refusing to answer pride with pride, she had given every one of us a gift that would remain long after the evening itself became nothing more than a memory. Eleanor glanced at the clock on the wall and smiled when she realized the evening had slipped away almost unnoticed. The foundation meeting could wait a little longer, but before she stood to leave, she looked around the dining room one final time. The room felt completely different from the one we had entered earlier that afternoon. Nothing about the furniture had changed. The crystal glasses still reflected the warm light. The flowers still rested in the center of the table. Yet the people sitting around it no longer carried the same expressions. Earlier, they had measured one another by appearance. Now they seemed far more interested in listening than judging. That change alone made the evening worthwhile. Brittany quietly returned from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Without drawing attention to herself, she walked around the table offering refills to every guest before finally stopping beside Eleanor. "May I pour you another cup?" she asked softly. Eleanor thanked her with the same warm smile she offered everyone else. There was no hesitation in her voice and no trace of resentment. Watching that simple exchange reminded me that forgiveness rarely arrives with dramatic speeches. More often it appears in ordinary moments when someone chooses kindness instead of keeping score. Michael looked toward his wife before speaking. "Mom, Dad, I think Brittany and I have spent too much time trying to build a life that looked successful instead of one that actually felt meaningful." His words were honest, and I could hear the weight behind them. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Many people confuse admiration with fulfillment. They are not the same thing. Michael slowly smiled. "I think I am finally beginning to understand that." One of the guests leaned forward with curiosity. "Mrs. Whitmore, after everything you have accomplished, what achievement makes you proudest?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. She looked around the table as though carefully considering every face before speaking. "This one." The guest appeared puzzled. Eleanor continued gently. "If one difficult evening helps even one family choose respect over pride, then it has already become one of the most valuable evenings of my life." No one spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. Brittany quietly wiped a small tear from the corner of her eye before looking directly at Eleanor. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become better instead of making me feel smaller." Eleanor reached across the table and lightly touched her hand. "We all need grace at different moments in life. Someday someone else will need yours." I watched Brittany nod with quiet determination. For the first time since she had joined our family, I believe she truly understood what Eleanor had tried to teach without ever preaching. The guests gradually gathered their coats and prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, several of them thanked Eleanor not for her generosity, influence, or accomplishments, but for her wisdom. One gentleman admitted that he intended to call his elderly mother the following morning because the evening had reminded him how easily people could take loved ones for granted. Another guest quietly promised to volunteer with a local charity after hearing Eleanor describe the joy of serving others without expecting recognition. As the front door opened, the cool evening air drifted inside. The chauffeur respectfully approached to escort Eleanor to the waiting automobile. Before leaving, she slipped her familiar blue cardigan over her shoulders once again. Brittany noticed and smiled with gentle surprise. "You are wearing it again?" Eleanor laughed softly. "It is still my favorite sweater." Everyone laughed with her, not because the cardigan had suddenly become fashionable, but because they finally understood what it had represented all along. It had never been about fabric, style, or price. It had simply been another reminder that true worth cannot be stitched into clothing or displayed through possessions. As Eleanor and I walked toward the waiting automobile together, I looked at the woman beside me and realized that the greatest luxury I had ever known was not the elegant car waiting outside. It was spending 46 years beside someone whose character never changed, no matter how the world chose to see her. Eleanor and I stepped outside together, and the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of freshly cut grass through the quiet neighborhood. The chauffeur opened the rear door once again, but before we entered the automobile, Eleanor paused and looked back toward Michael's front porch. Brittany and Michael were standing side by side, watching us with expressions that had changed more in a single evening than I would have believed possible. There was no embarrassment left in their faces. There was only reflection. Eleanor raised her hand and smiled, and they both smiled back. It was a simple farewell, yet it felt like the beginning of something new rather than the end of something uncomfortable. As the automobile moved slowly away from the house, I turned toward my wife and quietly laughed. You knew exactly what was going to happen, did not you? She looked out the window for a moment before answering. No, Thomas. I only knew what kind of person I wanted to remain, regardless of what anyone else chose to become. That answer stayed with me during the entire drive. Many people spend years trying to change how others see them. Eleanor had spent her life making sure she never changed herself simply to satisfy someone else's expectations. That was a lesson far more valuable than any financial success we had ever experienced. The following weekend, Michael called and invited us to dinner again. This time, there was no elaborate display, no attempt to impress anyone. Brittany greeted Eleanor with a warm embrace before taking her coat. The familiar blue cardigan rested over Eleanor's shoulders once again, and this time Brittany smiled as she admired it. I hope you keep wearing that sweater for many more years, she said sincerely. It reminds me that I almost missed seeing the remarkable woman wearing it. Eleanor laughed softly and hugged her back. Nothing else needed to be said. Real apologies are not measured by the length of the words spoken. They are measured by the consistency of the actions that follow. Over the months that came after, we noticed small changes that eventually became lasting habits. Michael spent more weekends visiting us without checking his phone every few minutes. Brittany began volunteering with the Whitmore Family Foundation several Saturdays each month, never asking for recognition or photographs. She quietly organized clothing drives, helped distribute scholarships, and listened to families whose stories reminded her how quickly appearances could deceive. More than once I caught Eleanor watching her with quiet pride, though she never mentioned it aloud. She believed encouragement was strongest when offered gently rather than dramatically. Looking back now, I sometimes think about how easily that evening could have ended with anger, arguments, and damaged relationships. Instead, Eleanor chose patience over pride. She allowed truth to reveal itself naturally, without trying to humiliate anyone in return. That decision changed not only one family dinner, but also the direction of several lives. I often hear people say that respect must be demanded. After spending 46 years beside Eleanor, I have learned something different. Genuine respect is quietly earned through thousands of ordinary choices made when no one is watching. Expensive automobiles eventually become older models. Designer clothing goes out of fashion. Elegant houses require repairs. Even successful careers eventually come to an end. But compassion, humility, integrity, and quiet dignity continue growing more valuable with every passing year. Whenever I think about that unforgettable evening, I do not remember the polished automobile waiting in the driveway or the surprised expressions around the dinner table. I remember my wife calmly putting her old blue cardigan back on before leaving the house. In that single moment, she reminded everyone present, including me, that true elegance is never found in the things we wear, the vehicles we ride in, or the wealth people imagine we possess. It lives in the way we choose to treat others, especially when we have every opportunity to do otherwise. And after all these years, I still consider myself the richest man in the room, because every morning I wake up beside the woman who taught me that lesson simply by living it.